able to
make
be
their
farther
thing
back
and
if
that.
you're really gonna get that nice arch. I mean, you have to go straight
Because
up
I'm
and straight
sitting
down.
here
It
with,
is.
Okay.
But
I
no
didn't
telling.
Yeah, I did feel bad for him.
at the register, it knows what all.
Well, Granddad has a little bag.
So it'll.
That's what I'm saying. He always has a bag, doesn't he? Not a purse, just a bag. I always see him with a bag.
Somebody gave him some.
Yeah, with the baseball sitting in the back. That, yeah.
Well, my little brother, he loves it. He said he doesn't do it anymore.
Hey.
I made it back around.
That's good. I'll definitely
Apparently tonight there's.
I mean.
Did you have fun at the wedding?
Been to a wedding in so long.
They have them
Outside.
It was an outside wedding in July.
5
Egypt,
o'clock.
actually.
The
Yeah.
sun.
It was hot.
Down.
Everyone was really good there. I didn't understand.
It was
Like
beautiful.
just
It was
how
at
much.
this-
No, he's home.
From there,
I
you think, okay, where to go?
Valley.
So we went to Costco, I had 15 of these.
Egypt.
And
Stolen. And then Greece also kind of stole the language from Egypt.
Because
Yeah,
we're
that's
here,
pretty dumb.
and you were like,
We had a
yeah.
guy that helped me learn lyrics. So I was pretty cool.
Most of the time, give it to
Wow.
Yeah.
Alright, I think it's time to get started.
Just leave the door open or close it.
They were huge.
Go ahead and close it.
Some of the houses and stuff we saw. And so, okay, this took forever to go. Like, this took forever to car. This thing. But.
Good morning, everybody. We'll have everyone slowly trickle in. I slowly trickled in myself today. A little coffee incident, had to go back and change. You have those days sometimes.
Sounds like the type of incident that you could write a song about.
Maybe I will someday.
We're gonna look at Psalm 90 today. And you probably noticed that the book of, what we call the book of Psalms, is divided into books itself, divided into 5 books. And we looked at Psalm 22, and that's in book 1. And when we looked at Psalm 51, that's in book 2. And both of those are Psalms of David, and they were both Psalms of disorientation, where David feels like there's a gap between him and his God.
One of the things that I've learned from studying those two psalms was, sometimes when you look at a book in a different context, you sort of gain different things from it that maybe you didn't see before. It just reminds me that when I was younger, I had sort of this epiphany about Bathsheba. And I thought her name was Sheba, and they called her Bathsheba because David saw her taking a bath. It's just one of those things where how a child's brain processes things. So like if he had seen her doing laundry or something, she would have been Laundry Sheba. But later was able to gain that new insight from studying it again, having teachers correct me. Hopefully you guys gained a little more insight than that, a little deeper insight than what I did. But we're gonna jump into a new psalm today.
At some point, I feel like I have failed as a father. Should have had a little better devotionals or something. Okay, so this psalm is called a Psalm of Moses. It says Psalm 90, and it opens book 4. And it's different from the other psalms in that there's no hint of disorientation at all. Moses understands who God is and knows his relationship with God. And even though there's a little bit of a cloud over this psalm, it's not disoriented. Moses is not lost. He knows exactly what's going on where he is. He talks about the eternal nature of God and contrasts that with man's short lifespan. He talks about God's omnipotence and man's dependence on God's power. And this could even be categorized as a wisdom psalm, and we'll see that near the end, where Moses gives advice, both, I think, to the congregation and to himself, recognizing that God is the only recourse we have in overcoming our inherent weaknesses and in the relatively short time frame that we have on earth. But Psalm 90 could also be categorized as a community lament, because it's a psalm that expresses the pain of a worshiping community and crying out for relief and forgiveness and restoration, but yet not feeling out of touch with God. And it's like a psalm of disorientation would express. So Moses just he smells the rose, but he recognizes the thorn that's attached to it as well. It's really just a wonderful song of praise that's rooted in reality at the same time. And it also declares the everlasting presence of God and just shows that the man just has a few years here before we give up our bodies and return to the elements. And Moses almost, I think, invents the old adage, life is hard and then you die. That's sort of what he says here, but he's not complaining about that. He's just stating it as a fact. For the Israelites, for Moses, life was pretty hard, and then you die.
So we've mentioned before that this is perhaps the oldest psalm in the Psalter, because it was written by Moses. There are a few psalms that have an unattributed author, so we're not exactly sure what generation those fall into. But if this is indeed the oldest psalm, I find it fitting that I'm partnered with the oldest teacher we could find at Three Chaps to
Take that hug back.
But I'm going to read through these 17 verses for us, and as I'm reading, I want you to sort of put yourself in the shoes of Moses. Like try to imagine what are some of the emotions that he might be feeling as he's writing these words. What are some things that maybe he experienced in his lifetime that would have inspired him to write a psalm like this? So this is Psalm 90. I'm going to read verses 1 through 17. It says, it's a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations, before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting. You are God. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by the evening it's dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You've set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Relent, O Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands.
This psalm is and it was and it still is used as a reading at funerals, especially in the Jewish community. And a lot of the psalms in Book 4 are good for congregational worship, and this is just an example of that. This psalm makes very clear the difference between God's eternality and man's fleetingicity, I guess. And yet, though the song does make clear that death will overtake us all, there's still a positivity found in it. It's not a fear of death, and it's just that God is always in charge. God is in all, and He's over all, and He exists through all time.
That idea of God being, He exists in past, present, and future all at once. It's hard for us to contemplate that. It sort of makes me think of this past Father's Day, something that I said to Dad. I said, Dad, forget about the past, because you can't change it. Forget about the future, because it's unpredictable. Forget about the present, because I didn't get you one.
Some of the Psalms of David are laments. David had sons, so I'm starting to see some of his inspiration for those laments.
That's sweet. I'm glad that I inspired you.
Your inspiration.
But it also brings to mind this sort of hard, at least for me, it's this hard to grasp concept that mankind is bound by space and time, while God is not. He created space and time. He is not bound by those. He's eternal. He's everlasting. And I remember one time when I traveled to Australia, I remember we left the LA airport on a Wednesday and then landed in Sydney on a Friday. And I was just kind of confused when I got off the plane. I was just like, what happened to Thursday? I wasn't in the air for 24 hours, but somehow I lost an entire day. And so that was sort of the first time that it kind of made me consider how global time zones work and how much, counting time is and sort of an ingrained integral part of my, my being. That it's just as a person, time is very important to us. And so when we think about the span of our own existence and its fleetingicity, to your phrase, I don't think that's a word, but we'll use it. When you compare that to sort of the expansiveness of eternity, it can start to feel a little bit overwhelming. And we know that our bodies are temporary, yet we're told that our souls are eternal. So I sort of feel like I'm caught in this paradox of, am I eternal? Am I temporal? Our attention is constantly bouncing between sort of the chaos of everyday life and the peace and quietude of being in the presence of God. And so it seems that as I read this, it sounds a little bit like Moses may be wrestling with this sort of balance of existence as well.
I think so. Let's look at the psalm a little more closely, starting with the little title above it. In my translation, it says, "A prayer of Moses, the man of God." And then Moses starts out saying, "Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place for all generations." So there are two different words here for God, where it says Moses was a man of God. That's Adonai, and so it says that Moses has made God his Lord and Master, Adonai, and so he is God's man. He's the man of God because he is under God's sovereignty. But then when Moses begins his song, he doesn't use that same word Adonai. He calls him Yahweh, the most reverent, holy name that he could use for God. And so it's interesting that there are two different words here for God just next to each other. Moses, the man of Adonai, and then Yahweh, you are our dwelling place. So finish this statement. Home is where the heart is. Yeah, home is where the heart is. Judy and I say, home is
Did I say
where,
dinner? Is that what you said?
home is where there's always someone standing in front of the drawer that you're trying to get to in the kitchen. Could you move over? But so home is where the heart is. When we have God in our heart, it doesn't matter where we are on this earth, we're at home. We're at home. We're with God, and that's where we want to be. So
That's sort of, let me interject here, that sort of makes me think of something that your mom, my grandmother Imogene, used to talk about in Philippians 4:8. She would say, she would talk about how it says to think on whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is true. And then to her, that meant that if those things were in your heart, when those little demons of doubt are trying to get in, there's no room there because the place is already filled. And I just always loved that how she would make that connection. And so, if God is our home and He lives in us, then we can feel safe and secure in that.
So Moses doesn't say, God, for the last 40 years or whenever he wrote this, of wandering in the wilderness, he doesn't say, God, our home has been in tents, our home has been in shelters in the wilderness. He says, God, our home has been in you. That even though we've been wandering around in the wilderness for a long time, we're still at home because you're with us. And so that's his point there. And I think home can also be interpreted as a refuge, a place of safety and security and protection. And that's what the 12 tribes needed as they wandered. They needed that protection and they needed that security that came from God. To be homeless physically is kind of a bad deal. But if you're homeless spiritually, that's being absolutely lost. And so in verse 2, Moses talks about the mountains. I'm sure that there were times as they were wandering, he'd look at the mountains from a distance and see their majesty, or when they would camp at the foot of the mountain, and he'd think about the solidity of that mountain and how solid it was. But then he'd realize that really God is older than this mountain. In fact, this mountain did not exist until God spoke it into existence. And then he talks about the 1,000 years as a day. I don't think this is a formula for time.
Yeah, I don't think so. But let me touch on verse 3 here real quick. You turn people back to dust, saying, "Return to dust, ye mortals." What might have prompted Moses to write words like this? What was it?
Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. Okay, so he was inspired to write it. What happened in his life that he might have been able to relate this to?
Lot's wife.
Sorry?
Lot's wife.
Lot's wife? Okay. Tell us a little bit about that.
When Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by the fire and brimstone, I guess, and he said, "Don't look back," and they were fleeing, and she looked back.
Okay.
Yeah, that was Lot. Yep.
The pillars of salt, yeah. Maybe he was thinking about, people that were dear to him that had died. Miriam, Aaron. Maybe he's thinking about, the Israel had sort of been wandering in the desert and there's so much dust around, and so he's just sort of, had dust on the mind. Who knows? It's sort of reminiscent of what we see Solomon talking about in Ecclesiastes, where he says, "All come from dust, and to dust will return." It's sort of this idea that comes from the creation account, where God created Adam from the dust of the earth, and so just this idea that the crude matter that we're made of is just dust, and so he expounds on this idea, like you said, about the 1,000 years, 1,000 years is like a day to God. That's not a literal formula where you can calculate how old God is or anything like that. But it's just a perspective that can make, like I talked about earlier, this lifetime feel fleeting when compared to eternity. It's sort of hyperbolic language that's similar to when God told Abraham, your descendants will be numbered like what? Stars in the sky, or
Sand,
grains of sand, dust on the earth. It's just meant to show how sort of mind-bogglingly large and the power of the extent of God's power is. And Dad, maybe I came across this phrase of watching the night. Maybe you can help me interpret this one. I know when I take my watch off at night, it continues to work, just like God does. He never stops working. Is that how you see that?
I'm pretty sure Moses didn't have a wristwatch. I think they only had grandfather clocks back then. So no, that's not the watch in the night he's talking about.
Okay. I suppose he didn't say a sundial in the night because it was only working the daytime.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, it seems that Moses is sort of building on this 1,000 years analogy that a millennium is just like the time that a night watchman would do in a shift, which was not that long. I think it's like 3 hours. So by those calculations, a day would be 8,000 years. And so it's the point is, time is very relevant to us. It's very relevant to man. It's irrelevant to God. That is why God sort of has the authority to say, "Return, O children of man." That's not a request. It's more of a command.
Yeah. And so as we look through, verse 5 on down, he just talks about the fleeting nature of life and about the cycles of life and how there's birth and death. And I'm sure part of that was he was thinking about the manna, that it was there fresh every morning and then it was gone by the evening. So, and then in verse 7, he just talks about the wrath of God and that we've placed our iniquities before you, even the secret ones. And we remember David talking about, there is no secrets before God. So you can't keep your sins secret from him as well. But as we get down into verse 12, this is really where the wisdom teaching begins. And it says, "Teach us to number our days." Moses is wanting the singers of this song to be reminded of the brevity of life and the fragility of our existence. And he's probably writing to himself as well as to the congregation. And there's a phrase here, 13, do return, O Lord. That reminds me of in verse 3, where God says, "Return, O man," and now man is saying, "Return, God. We need you. Come back and come quickly." And it kind of reminds me of the end of the Revelation to John, where Jesus said, "I'm coming and I will return." And John says, "Come, Lord Jesus." And so that's both a promise and a warning in that. And I will give you a heads up that you might need to be prepared, because there's a little redheaded girl in here that I know that the lovely Miss Jude, she prays this often. "Come, Lord Jesus, come." That when things are just, we're just ready. So don't be shocked if it happens soon, because I know that Judy has prayed for that a lot.
Verse 12 also is a little bit reminiscent of Psalm 139 in verse 16. That says, "Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." And so teaching us to number our days is to have a consideration of death as a certainty. That's not something that we can escape, and the eternal consequences that are going to await each of us at that point. And teaching us, what does that imply? It sort of implies that there's something to be learned, right? And so what are some experiences that you think some people go through that help us internalize this lesson? Is there a difference between learning something with our minds and learning something with our hearts? What does it mean, teach us to number our days? What's that mean to you?
Well, this is kind of around the corner to tell you this, but we come past two beautiful cemeteries on the way to church. Every time we come, we pass them. But this morning, I was looking, it was beautiful, all the flowers, and there was somebody out there at the bottom. And I thought, oh gosh, they're reflecting on the life of the one that was buried. But I said to Jack, isn't it amazing? Every one of these markers and all of these flowers represent a life, the growing up, the marrying maybe, the having children, raising them, the toils and troubles of building a career, and then finally they lay to rest. So I said, that's really our destiny, you know. And he said, no, it's not. We really don't just stay there. And I said, no, we don't. But it was just kind of an interesting reflection. Here we're talking about it in class. But yeah, every time we go by, I always look for the great big green canopy. Yeah,
That's what our bodies are destined for.
that's right.
And then our real selves, there's a destiny
Yep.
involved in that as well.
Mhm.
And it's one of two.
Right.
And who we subject ourselves to while we're in this body will determine that
Right.
final destination. So. Yeah, and I agree. I think funerals are a place where a lot of people come to, it's a good come to Jesus type of place when people are thinking about. And, you know, there's a,
Especially when you're getting older.
yep. Mike Palmer encourages me sometimes. There's a couple of summers ago, we were going somewhere together and we were talking, we got to talking serious about life and I said, well, you know, Mike, that really there's only, I may have only like 5 summers left, you know, for me to do things with, you know.
4
and-
after this one.
And so the next year, that was my story. The next year, Mike comes up to me and just does this. And I'm like, what? He said, you know, last year you had 5, now it's, so, yeah, and can't argue, you know. But I don't know how many more summers I get, but, you know, I'm at the age where I know it's not gonna be a whole sack full of summers, so I have to deal with that.
It
I
Oh, go ahead.
blackball my family because I said, you know, I'm not gonna be here very many more years, so you need to come. You need to come. And they said, oh, we have to go. We have to go because she's not gonna be here for about 4 or 5 more summers. And I'm like, now, as long as it will, go for it.
gotta lay it on thick.
I'll take it.
We've got 15 minutes left, so I wanna dive into some application here to make sure that we, so if we had to pick 3 words of application for this chapter, I think they might be gratefulness, contentment, and readiness. So in the context that we're talking about here, the context of time, and our days being numbered, it's, you know, finding ways to be grateful for our past and what has brought us to where we are now. It's finding ways to be content with the present and our current circumstances, and then making ourselves ready for what God does have in store for us in the future.
So, you know, being grateful is pretty simple. If we were born into a functional family, middle class or more, and our, you know, we've gotten educated and we haven't had to scrounge in dumpsters for food and we haven't been homeless. So being grateful is kind of easy for that. But what about if our lives have been more challenging? is it more challenging to be grateful? Well, probably in some ways. But what can we always be grateful for? One of the things is we can be grateful that that part of our life is behind us. You know, thank you that I've gotten through that to be where I am now. But even if where I am now is not the greatest place to be, not where exactly I would choose to be.
Dust.
So that resonates with you? So, what is there to be grateful for?
Gone from here.
So what'd you say?
You're gone from here.
Yeah, that there is more to come. There is more to come, something better to come. So I'm grateful for that.
It's sort of this idea of gladness from affliction. If you look in verse 15, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. So you see that even though there is affliction, there has been sorrow, there has been trauma experienced. There's a hopefulness that God will restore you blessings in a measure that will counteract any of the prior troubles. And then, in verse 14, when we think about contentedness, satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love. So Moses is seeking satisfaction in the Lord and seeking contentment with present circumstances. So what are some of the things, I'll toss it out to you guys, what are some of the things that sort of get in the way of contentedness? What are some things that prevent us from feeling content?
I think when I have this restless spirit about me, maybe not content, I think that there's idolatry, I'm chasing the world maybe too much, and maybe sometimes not really aware of it, but I think that leads to discontentment, where we're putting our trust in anything else but God to make us happy and fulfill our lives. So
I can relate to that, yeah, for sure. Everybody hear what he said? Yeah.
I feel like sometimes there's an attitude of entitlement, especially in our nation and culture.
Oh, I deserve better, yeah.
And so there's a priority of self-care and everything, to the point where if we don't have everything we think we should have or we think we're entitled to, it can become difficult to be content.
And it reminds me of the example that Paul gave us in the New Testament when there was a part of his life that he was not satisfied with. And so he prayed to God, can you change this in my life? Can you give me this in my life? And this is, and he may have had a sense of entitlement as well. God, look, who's your guy here? It's me. And I'm just asking for this. And God's answer was, Paul, my grace is, how can you ask for more than that? That's sufficient. If you don't have anything else, you have my grace. Okay, and then Paul says, in all things, I am content. I am content. I'm okay with that. God says, my grace is sufficient. Yes, it is. And I can be content in that. Yeah.
So gratefulness, contentment, let's talk about readiness, being ready for the future. In some ways, this can be the most important one, because the future eventually becomes the present and the past, right? So it covers the whole gamut. In verse 17, we see Moses asking, may the favor of the Lord our God rest on us, establish the work of our hands for us. He's asking God for something here, right? And I think if we were to ask the same question, God, establish the work of my hands, that could feel a little bit nebulous, because we're kind of like, okay, how do I know what's the work of my hands? What's that going to be? And then we might start to feel a little inadequate. How do I know how he wants me to serve him? What if I'm ill-equipped? And if you consider Moses and his story, he felt inadequate and ill-equipped when we look in Exodus about when God had just instructed Moses to go to the elders of Israel and tell them about the plan to free themselves from Egyptian rule. You know, he's worried about being laughed at and mocked. And what does God say to Moses? He says, "Moses, what's that in your hand?" And to me, I've never really considered how profound that is. You know, he doesn't tell Moses, "Okay, you got to go through this training regimen, and then once you're ready, I'm going to send you." He just says, "What do you have?" And Moses, you know, what was it in his hand? He had a staff, right? And so God used that to convince the leaders of Israel. And so let's ask ourselves that same question: what's in our hands? What do I possess currently that God can use? And just start there. You know, our gratefulness and contentment and readiness cannot be dependent on if onlys. You know, if only the time was right, or if only I had more money, or if only I were more confident, if only I had more Bible knowledge. You know, there's this endless list of if only things were different. And God does not operate on if onlys. He operates with what is, and he can use that.
And you know, I think it's funny that sometimes the people who are doing a lot are the ones who feel the most inadequate. You know, how many times have we heard our shepherds say, I do the best I can, but sometimes I just feel so inadequate for this job. And yet they're full of wisdom. They're doing a great job of leading us, but yet there's still this feeling. I know that Billy has expressed several times as a great preacher. Sometimes I just feel like I'm not getting through, and we just have to say, "Man, you are." But anyway, this Psalm 17 is just such a great psalm. It's a psalm of praise. It's a psalm of confession. It's a psalm of recognition of God's great glory and omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence. It's a clear reminder of man's fragility, and it imparts wisdom that's inherent in acknowledging all those things and the need for us to be in the favor of the Lord. So when Moses says here in verse 16, "Let your work appear to your servants." As BJ said, this is sort of two things. Let us see your work, but also show your work. What would you have us to do as your servants? And with that in mind, we're going to sing this as a closing song of God, show us your work. Let me be a servant to you.
Any song leaders in here, or do I have to start this one? Make me a servant, Lord, make me like you, for you are a servant, make me one too. Make me a servant, do what you must do, to make me a servant, make me like you.
We kept you 2 minutes overtime last week, so we gave them back to you this week. We're even. I'm still looking for that part.
Get in the car this morning and Bella still gave me my laptop with notes right there. I sat down and just
So. I didn't know.
Change clothes.
change clothes and reprint my
Mail.
notes because I was so